few thoughts today, and thinking about the temperature, especially outside and soon inside, and people wanting to make the most of the weather, perhaps. I will try to be brief, and I can be brief. You may not believe that, but it is possible. The passage that John read to us from the letter to the Ephesians was probably not written by Paul. It was written probably towards the end of the first century, that last decade of the first century. And most scholars assign a date of around the year 90 or early 90s to it. Now, there are books written about why Paul didn't write this letter, and I'm not going to interest or bore you with that, depending on how you would find analysis in that regard. But one of the main points is why they say Paul didn't write it was the nature of the language. If you listen to the passage or perhaps read it again, there are quite impressively long sentences in it. It's difficult to really follow it while just listening to it and while not reading it. And even though Paul could write very impressively long sentences, more so than the ones we find here, when he was addressing congregations, he would in the first place reveal an intimate knowledge about the people that he was writing to, very specific things that he would address in his dealing with a congregation or a church. And it would normally be of shorter length when he was talking about these specific matters. We find the opposite here. It's general information or themes addressed in a general matter, no specific revealing of very detailed and intimate knowledge of the congregation or the church in Ephesus. So Paul probably didn't write it. But I think there is still good themes and even relevance for today for us present in this letter. The last decade and onwards for the Christian churches, the early Christian church, was a tenuous time. If I had to do a strategic analysis like we do today of, all right, what does the future hold for an institution or a business or so forth, I would have advised the early Christian church to close shop and say, listen, you're wasting your time here. The odds are stacked against you to such an extent that I don't see you making it. It was a time when, just after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, what that meant was that the early Christian church, which was mainly consisting of Jewish people at that stage, was disrupted to a severe extent. Their bastion, their cultural center, was destroyed, and the city where the temple was also destroyed. So the basis and the feeding area of this church was just no longer there. And secondly, with the destruction of the temple and Rome being increasingly upset about the Jewish revolt and their behavior as a colony or as a vassal state, they were also associating the Christians with the Jewish people, and therefore also coming down on the Christians. And furthermore, the Christians did themselves the favor of fully antagonizing Rome by saying, no, Caesar is not God, Jesus is Lord. And that was regarded as sedition, as insurrection. So when you look at all that You say, well, there's not a good probability of this fledgling movement, the Jesus movement, surviving into the future. You can add to that friction between Paul's main audience, the non-Jewish component of the church, and the Jewish component were having quite a struggle of getting along. They were at each other's throats. Especially from the Jewish side, no, we can't accept these pagans. You know, they're not circumcised. They're not God's people, and so forth and so forth. The end of the background story. The sermon title refers to, or is also the title of a series that we're doing in Bible study, Living the Questions. And I want to recommend that. It's excellent material, contemporary, with the input of exceptionally good scholars. We watch a video, short video, and then there's very good questions that you can respond to in your own time, and we gather so far on Zoom, and we have a wonderful conversation about the material. So you can also just study it in your own time. You don't have to attend the session. And there's no questions of copyright and so forth because we purchased the series. It's really rock bottom price for what you get. The purpose of this series is an attempt of leading scholars, theologians, and other scholars and leaders in the Christian church to respond to questions facing the church and facing a Christian trying to live in the modern world, or the postmodern world, rather. How do you live? What do you do? And what are the difficulties and the problematic we face when we try to be followers of Jesus? What should we do? How should we do it? How do we respond to the different crises we face in the world? And what does our sacred text, the Bible, say about it? That's more or less the approach. And instead of saying, no, we don't want to think about it, we don't want to confront the questions, these authors admirably put it right out there and say, listen, this is the story. Let's think about it, let's talk about it. I want to share with you a story about a good friend of mine. I say he's a good friend, but he lives in South Africa and I haven't spoken to him for probably a decade, so maybe he's not alive anymore. But at some stage we were good friends. And he told me he was laughing at himself. He could also make a living as a stand-up comic, but he instead opted to go to Parliament in South Africa. He became a politician. And I don't say politicians are clowns, and I'm not inferring that either. But he ended up in Parliament with a huge majority because he was a very likable guy, and he could put up a good show. So for his maiden speech, he practiced it quite well. Put a lot of time and work into it, and as he was delivering it, somebody asked a question on a point of order. And they asked a question that he hadn't considered and that pulls the rug from underneath him for his presentation, the argument he was making. And everybody knew that that's the question, and he doesn't address that question. So instead of abandoning everything or changing his speech, in his comic stand-up way, he said, I've heard your question, but there is no such question. It doesn't exist. And he just carried on. And that's one way to deal with it, to say, there is no such question. And unfortunately, that is quite often also the way that the church tried to be in the world. when the question comes to us through the lives and the experience and the difficulties experienced by people who try to stay faithful to the church often has the attitude, that is not a valid question. That question does not exist. You cannot ask that question because there is no such question, like my friend said in Parliament. There is no such question, let's just carry on with business, denying it. One would have thought that the pandemic would have changed the way that same tendency exists in society, that we would have been forced to a more realistic dealing with reality. Because death, life and death was literally involved. But we saw that even in that circumstance, and the pandemic is still with us, if not so much in the US, in the rest of the world. Even there we see that there is still a lot of denial and saying, no, that condition or that question does not exist. That reality is not present. We don't have to acknowledge it, we don't have to deal with it. We can pretend that the question does not exist. Due to the pandemic, hard questions were also forced on us as Christian Church worldwide, but also for us, a few souls gathered here today. We were forced to, on very short notice, move from a full in-person community to a full digital existence. And there was no manual to consult, how do you do this in about 2 weeks' time. There was no research that you can say, all right, evidence indicate these and these studies by clever people and respectable institutions that you can say, all right, this is the best way to do this. There was no precedent of anybody that was alive that could tell us when a pandemic sets in, this is how you do church. And the televangelists had it easier. They could carry on more or less like they were. And there were some that had really interesting presentations around it. I see Dave Reed is smiling. He has one favorite televangelist that he can share with you, how he responded to the pandemic. But for us, it was a bit more difficult. And I can say there is a book by evangelical theologian Brian McLaren, who writes, I think, some good stuff. And the title of the book is, We Make the Road by Walking It. I think it's a book that you can consider reading. But I want to say that we had to make the road not by walking it, but make the road while walking it. That was what was presented to us. We had to, in a very short time, figure out how to use Zoom, what to do and what not to do. And the worst thing about it was that you only found out while you were doing things what worked and what not, in real time. I want to say it's one of the best schools to acquire humility that I've ever been in. It's, I think, a good spiritual practice to acquire humility, is to try and switch over from an in-person community to one that is digital and doing it through Zoom. We had to adapt very quickly. We had to respond to the questions asked of us. We had to move from a relationship built on personal contact to try and maintain relationships while watching each other if we were fortunate and Zoom worked and the sound worked, by watching each other on screen. For me personally, it was terrible. I know one thing for certain, I don't know much, but one thing I know is that I don't want to be a televangelist. Unless the pay is really, really good, I'll endure it. I have a friend who always, when we ponder questions about church and so forth together, tells me, for instance, about retirement. And I said to him, how long are you still going to work? And he said, I'll have to work forever if I want to survive. And I said, why do you say that? Then he would always say, there's nothing to clear the mind like a lack of options. And in a sense, we also face that. As a church, what could we do? We didn't have much of a choice. We had to say, all right, this is what we do now. We walk this road, or we make the road while walking it. And today I look back with a huge sense of gratitude towards our leadership and also our staff, who responded to the questions asked of us. We were living those questions. We were making the road while walking it. And as we're doing it today again with communion, trying to figure out what people are sensitive to and will this work or not. We're still doing it with our team of technical volunteers who put in an immense number of hours. And I want to applaud them again today. We're still trying to figure out how to best use the gifts that the people responded to so wonderfully when we said we need to upgrade the system so that we can do a proper Zoom service. With this as well, we're making the road while walking it, trying to figure out how do you address the three audiences, people in person, people on Zoom, people on community TV. And we're facing the question, will that change the nature of the church? Essentially, how do we do it? Which is the dominant part of the community where we place our emphasis? I don't know. And I want to invite you to journey with us as we address these questions, trying to figure out how to be church in this new mode of existence, where we need to be interactive, because that is the nature of our church. Personal relationships and creating community and building community towards what we hope will be the beloved community, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it. I want to celebrate, looking back, the response of, for instance, the parish care team to the new situation and conditions, continuing with the wonderful work they did. I see there are three members of our, I think it's three of our Emerson Fields Committee here. 4. 5, I think. We're up to 7 if I continue, but I don't think the full committee is here. But I want to commend them as well. In spite of everything, they continued faithfully, doing the hard work, the difficult work. I want to commend the council, church council, and all council members and board members continuing with the work. Our community garden is still flourishing. There is a labyrinth installed that happened during the pandemic. And it testifies for me to the resilience and the commitment and the creative spirit that is alive in the congregation. And I want to invite you, as we make this road while walking it, let us nourish and protect that spirit. And let us also, as we gather around the table this morning, open ourselves so that the Spirit of Christ may be alive in us, may lead us, and may nurture us, so that the response to the questions that are put to us may be a response grounded in compassion, seeking justice, and creating hope. May that be how we make the road into the future while walking it. Amen.